There's a growing impatience in how people are learning photography nowadays. You buy a digital camera, you're super excited, you go out and you take 500 pictures in 10 minutes and check the LCD screen on every single one of them. And so the camera becomes both an instrument and a judge, and you never have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing how your photograph turned out. The feedback loop, shoot, check, adjust, and then repeat. Feels like progress, but in the early stages of learning, I'd argue that it's actually working against you. Now, before I go any further, let me make this abundantly clear because I made a video on why film photography won't make you a better photographer about 3 weeks ago. And some people understood it, but others couldn't really decipher the nuance of this conversation. My argument in that video was that just because you shoot film does not mean that the picture is any better than it would have been taken on digital. For some people, that went right over their heads. So let me make this abundantly clear. I am not anti-digital. I've never been a film purist. I still shoot digitally, even though, as you can see, there is an abundance of film cameras around me. I have written entire articles about how shooting film does not make people a better photographer. At a certain point, everybody who is serious about the craft of photography is going to shoot digitally. But there is a big difference between using digital and learning on digital. One is a workflow. The other is a foundation. And the foundations that we create when we're starting our crafts stick with us for a very long time. Which is why it's my belief that learning on an SLR, a film camera, forces a fundamentally different approach to photography when you're learning the craft. It removes the safety net of digital photography, and it introduces consequence earlier in your development process. And that consequence is one of the greatest teachers that the medium has to offer. Without it, you can spend years and years developing habits that feel like progress, but are actually, in the long run, obstacles in disguise. So, this is why I believe that if you're just starting off in photography, or if you find yourself in a plateau of some sort and you can't really explain why, you should consider picking up an SLR instead of the newest DSLR bodies. Hi, my name is Jared Thomas Tapey. I'm a social documentary photographer and educator here in New York City, and you're watching the YouTube channel. Across my social media platforms, I've created 6 different segments, all of which discuss very distinct things within the elements of photography. Crafting a photograph, life through the lens, marks of the maker, the creative connection, tools of the trade, and field notes. In today's lesson, we're going to be taking from my segment Tools of the Trade, where we discuss the gear, the tools, and the experiences that elevate the artist's journey. And in today's video, we're going to be discussing why I believe that if you're just learning photography, film photography can make you a better photographer. One of the best things about learning photography on an SLR is that the camera quite literally just does not care about your impatience. Film comes with constraints, and it's built that way by design. Inconvenient. They have a finite number of frames, 24 to 36 exposures on a regular roll. You don't get that instant feedback. There's no LCD system to look at after every single shot. There's no histograms. And really, even though some of the more advanced film cameras have them, like my Nikon F4, there's no real way to spray and pray your way through a scene. Every decision costs something. Time, money, and attention. And so that cost, as uncomfortable as it is at first, is exactly what makes an effective learning environment. I started learning photography when I was 6 years old. My mother got me a Kodak dispensable camera, and then a few years later, I got a Nikon Coolpix. It's right over here. This is it. A couple of years after that, I bought my first camera from Walmart, which was a Nikon D3300 with a kit lens. And it was during that first initial time that I thought that I was understanding the principles of discipline within the medium of photography. It wasn't until a couple of years later when I was gifted a Canon A1. It's right up here. This is my first film camera, Canon A1. After I got my Canon A1, what came afterwards was a realization. I didn't know shit. Even though I had been technically shooting before, on the Nikon D3300, I was shooting in manual mode and everything like that, but the process of it hadn't actually internalized because I had all of these different bells and whistles to tell me to correct things. With the Canon A1, the built-in limitations of the camera sharpened my awareness in a way that no manual system before had. The technical and mechanical side of the craft had all of a sudden become very tactile and real. Digital, for all of its remarkable advantages and tools and bells and whistles, often in the earlier stages, kind of negates that realization and reckoning. You can take like 500 images in a minute, and then you come home and you throw them on Lightroom and you hope that maybe 5 of them worked out. But that approach builds volume, not intention. But the really tricky part is that doesn't necessarily feel like a bad habit. You know, when you're just starting off, you think, oh, I gotta put the work in. I gotta go out there and make shots happen and keep shooting and keep shooting and keep shooting. And so it feels like a hustle. It feels like, you know, I'm getting somewhere. I know this mentality all too well because it's happened to me before in the past when I was first starting off, but it's very prevalent in today's world as well. The amount of times that I go out and I talk to new photojournalists or anything whenever I'm out on assignment, and they tell me that they come home with 3,500 photos or more. I don't tell them personally, so if they're watching it now, great, listen up. That number is not a sign of diligence, right? It's not like just because you're shooting an excessive amount of frames means that the frames that you're going to get are going to increasingly get better with each amount added on. But rather, it's a sign that something deeper isn't connecting yet. That instead of being fully present in the moments that are unfolding around you, you're photographing everything and hoping that you'll find something in the editing process later. Film makes that imposible. With a roll of 36 frames, you get exactly that, 36 frames. And that's just the standard. It goes lower than that. What that does is it forces you to be selective before you even press the shutter. That constraint early in your development doesn't limit your creativity, but actually can have an inverse effect. And that effect is focus. When you sit down later to review your work, that focus carries over. You approach a contact sheet much differently than you approach 1,500 thumbnails on Lightroom. You're not sorting through countless amounts of files hoping to find something meaningful, but instead you're studying what you captured within the frame. This is another really big lesson that I think you'll learn if you start off on an SLR, and it's that you learn exposure, not just settings. On digital, exposure can be taught as a crutch, especially with these modern cameras. Histograms, live previews, and an assorted amount of auto modes. All of these things in the modern age have become so incredibly sophisticated. And again, it's really cool. Like, it's such an amazing tool to be able to have these things. And I know that somebody somewhere is going to comment about the fact that if people like Elliot Erwitt or Mary Ellen Mark or any of the great photojournalists or photographers of the past had these tools, they'd be astounded. Sure, that may be true, but I think that they would get tired of them. Just like a lot of people who shoot film that have done professional work that do shoot digital photography shoot film for a very specific reason. But with all of these advancements and possibilities and everything, it's entirely possible to build a strong sense of fluency while still not really understanding what light actually is. Again, that's not a knock on the technology. For the working professional photographer, like I said, all of these tools are very helpful. But this lesson and the article that coincides with it is not for the working professional photographer. This is for people who are starting their journey in the craft of photography. Somebody who's trying to build a foundation. On an SLR, particularly one without some sort of advanced light meter, you're forced to understand exposure rather than correct it after the fact, meaning that you can't just defer the judgment. So as the photographer, you have to make the call before the shutter's pressed. Now, for me personally, that fundamentally changed my relationship with how I view light and understand a scene and understand light as a premise within a frame. It fundamentally changed it. And I say that because in the most non-braggadocious way possible, I have not used a light meter in years and years and years. Mainly because these cameras that I own, many of them don't have either a light meter at all or be a working light meter. And I'm not going to spend $500 on a light meter to carry around. Instead, over time, I've just been able to ascertain and understand what my settings and exposure and my f-stops and my shutter speed need to be at based on my own personal experience of being out and about all the time. For instance, my Rolleiflex, right? And they're not modern film cameras, they're still old film cameras, but they have the ability to change your ISO, right? Meaning that I can change it on the camera so that it understands what ISO I'm shooting at. With the Rolleiflex, that option is not available. So I just have to know all the time what my ISO rating has to be at in my head and make those adjustments in real time based on my settings on the camera. Through this process, I've been able to internalize what overexposure actually looks like out in the real world. I've been able to understand how shadows behave in a frame or on a scene and adjust properly before I press the shutter. And so in relation to that, my settings became a language for me that I became more fluent in because of the restrictions of using film. I think that it's worth thinking about the great Ansel Adams in this respect. He developed the zone system that basically everybody uses nowadays, right? It's one of the most rigorous and lasting fundamental practices as it pertains to the technical side of photography. He developed this not because he had access to an infinite feedback loop, but because he needed a precise, repeatable method for predicting exactly how a scene would render on film. That kind of deep literacy of the language of photography and light and exposure doesn't just come from guessing and checking on the back of your camera. It comes from a very deliberate, consequence-driven practice. Film is, in many ways, the natural environment for that practice. One of the most underrated lessons that film and SLRs teach is the act of patience. The moment that you capture something and the differing moment of reviewing what you captured. And that's because you shoot and then you wait. You finish the roll, you take it to get developed. Depending on where you go, or how busy the labs are, it can take a couple of days or it can take weeks. You finish the roll, you take it to get developed, and if you're lucky, you get to print your work as well, because that's a whole other video that you can check out up here when I made my first photographic color print. It's an entirely different process that you just don't quite get with digital photography in and of itself. Printing your work drastically changes your relationship with your work. And that's another big reason why I think that people should learn on an SLR and using film, but that's an entirely different video. But I do believe that once you're able to physically see what you get back, for the photographer that's accustomed to that instant gratification and feedback, that delay is for sure going to feel a little bit frustrating at first. But if you stick with it, it becomes one of the most clarifying lessons that the medium of photography has to teach you. And that's because the delay does something very important. It separates the act of photographing from the act of judging. When you're shooting digitally, it's almost impossible not to interrupt yourself and review your work. And when you do that, it's really, really hard not to readjust something or second guess something or move something around. It's very hard not to be thinking about these things. And it's precisely, and I'm going to speak directly to more so the type of work that I do as a street photographer, as a documentary photographer, and a photojournalist. The more that you initiate in that start and stop mechanism of checking and shooting and checking and shooting, the more likely it is that you're going to miss moments that you weren't privy to because you were too busy checking the back of your LCD system. For street photography, for documentary or photojournalism, things can happen so quickly. In a fraction of a second, a face can change, a fight can break out, light changes, the scene changes. All of these things happen incredibly quick, and you already have to be doing the attentive behavior of releasing oneself from the world so that you can view everything out in front of you and not be thinking about yourself all the time. That in and of itself is a big hurdle for people to get over. So the constant feedback loop of, I have to make sure that everything is perfect all of the time. I have to look at my LCD system. I have to shoot, review. It takes you out of the moment every single time. Film doesn't allow that. Film ensures that you stay in the scene, and it helps you understand, build, and trust your instincts. And that's because the evaluation portion happens later. And this is the big part. That evaluation point happens later with a clear mind and an objective eye. Joel Meyerowitz has spoken about this in an interview that I have tried to find for a year now, but I am 100% certain that it was Joel Meyerowitz that said this, because it stuck with me, and it's exactly why I'm telling you right now, and I just got to get it out. He talked about, it was some advice to new photographers. And there's a video on YouTube that is literally called Joel Meyerowitz's advice to new photographers, but it's not in that video. Basically, he's talking about the benefits of when he was learning photography and what film photography did for him. And it's the fact that when you're out and about, especially, again, I'm talking to street photographers, documentary photographers, photojournalists, lifestyle, whatever, even portrait or fashion or commercial photographers, there is a certain amount of adrenaline that happens when you're out shooting, right? You're excited. At least for me, whenever I'm out doing work for my book, the energy of the world around me flows through me, especially when I'm documenting in the city. It's like all of these grids are just an everlasting flow of energy. And when you get tapped into it, you get this sort of buzz. It's a feeling. You feel in tune with the world around you. And so you become really attached to the images that you make. Digital photography, when you're so entrapped by that energy, you come home and you edit right away, and you're very excited, and you have these emotional attachments to these photographs. And so what that does is create this dissonance between the objectivity of a good image and your emotional inability to detach the feelings that you had of taking the shot and editing the shot. Film does not allow that to happen. And so you wait a couple of days, or even, again, a couple of weeks, depending on how long it takes for development. And by the time that you get the image back, you have a more objective eye and a clearer mind. This allows you the opportunity to be more understanding of what makes the image good, meaning that you can assess what actually made the photograph work or not work. I think that this is another crucial time for me to stop and say something and clear something up, not because I'm going to apologize for it, and not because I don't want to step on any toes, but because I need people to understand. I said in my last video about film photography that I believe that film photography does not inherently slow you down. I think that that is a bad example of the benefits of film photography, and that's because you can be just as intentional with digital photography as you can with film photography. When people say, whenever they're interviewed about why they like film photography, and they say, oh, I like it because it slows me down. Bullshit. I know from experience that I can be just as intentional with digital photography as I can film photography, but it is much harder. Even now, with now over 10 years of shooting both digitally and on film, experience the thoughts of simply knowing that I have no limitations while shooting digitally makes me shoot more. I waste frames without even realizing it. It's nowhere near as much as it was when I was much younger, because the constraint that I've built up through years of experience at this point has allowed me to be more in tune with what I'm doing, but it's still very hard sometimes not to just fire off a couple shots and not be as aware of the world around me. That constraint had to be deliberately constructed over a long period of time. To expect a beginner to manufacture that constraint without the proper foundation to start is unrealistic in every sense of the word. But when the camera itself enforces that constraint, it removes that pressure that allows the photographer the act of simply seeing. Henri Cartier-Bresson spent his entire career talking about the decisive moment, the intuition and timing required to capture life as it actually is within that moment. That kind of attentiveness cannot thrive in an environment in which you are constantly checking your work. Film preserves that continuity that Henri Cartier-Bresson was so well known for. And when you don't start off with that foundation, it's much harder to actually get to the point of actually seeing. Which brings us to our next point of mistakes becoming teachers, not just fixes. On digital photography, mistakes are easy to correct. Underexposed, pull it up in post. Colors feel kind of dull, drop a LUT on it. But on film, those mistakes, they've got some weight. If you misjudge your exposure, tough shit, you gotta live with it. Or at the very least, you could try and salvage something. But the difference is that you remember it, and that's because film costs something. Time, attention, and money. And sometimes it costs you a frame that you were genuinely excited about or one that you genuinely cared about. When you have all of these capabilities and assets available to you as a digital photographer, which are a genuine asset, as I've said, what they can do is create a really bad habit for people who are just starting off, and that's just simply laziness. But the thing is you won't know what that laziness is until much later down the road. And then that's what causes these plateaus. When mistakes are correctable, they become forgettable. You can't build the same relationship or understanding with an error when you can just undo it. And because it costs you something, it genuinely teaches you something. There's also the contact sheet. I think that the contact sheet might be one of the most underappreciated tools that photographers who are just learning the craft of photography can use to better help their development process. Now, some photographers will argue that Lightroom is essentially the equivalent of a contact sheet, and technically, yes, they're correct in a way, but there's such a profound difference between holding something tangible, your contact sheet, and putting a loop up to it and putting your eye up to it and seeing what mistakes were made within a frame and actually having it in your hands and being able to see it with your eyes and hold it and touch it, compared to just skimming over multiple files on thumbnails on Lightroom. I don't know how to describe it other than the fact that the physicality of it just genuinely changes something in your brain chemistry. And it creates this different relationship with the work. And if you haven't experienced it before, you might not know what I'm discussing, which is why I encourage you to do it. Reviewing my contact sheets has consistently, literally every single time, revealed something about my practice of this craft that the screen-based looking experience on Lightroom just hasn't been able to do. It's so easy when it's physical to see where I've fallen back into old habits, to understand where I hesitated or when I overcrowded a frame. You could tell when you were playing it safe and you should have moved closer. And I think that that might just be because, again, one, it's physical, and two, there's typically only 36 frames unless you're using, like the Rolleiflex back here only gets 12. So then it's really important to be able to tell and see what your habits are. The physical medium demands a certain kind of attention that is just not really capable of being felt based off of the amount of scrolling that needs to happen or button pressing that needs to happen to go through all of your images, especially for new photographers that are still developing the discipline needed to look at your work critically. All of this to say that digital isn't the enemy, but it's not really the best teacher. Again, I really do want to stress that I don't want to come across as a film purist and that digital photography is not, a good thing. I love shooting digitally from time to time. And I'm definitely not telling you to like get rid of your digital cameras. That would be unrealistic and ill advice, not to mention just completely unnecessary. Because digital is faster and more flexible and more cost efficient for high volume work. Not to mention it's absolutely necessary for a lot of professional workflows. All of the tools that are available to you when shooting digital are extraordinary. But as a learning tool, as the lessons in which the environment of somebody that's learning the craft, someone that's first building their relationship to the world of photography and the technical aspects of photography and cameras as a whole, digital often teaches habits that need to be reassessed and relearned later on in your development process. Things like overshooting and over-relying on post-production, fixing instead of understanding, the act of collecting images instead of making them. Starting on an SLR, a film camera, builds opposite habits. You learn constraint. You learn to commit to a frame before you make it. You learn to trust your eye. One of the better ones is that you learn to accept your mistakes and learn from them. And crucially, all of these habits that you learn from starting your journey off in the photographic medium with an SLR translate really well over to digital photography. Whereas when you start off learning on digital photography, it's very hard to then translate that to film photography. So if you're serious about learning and developing in the craft of photography, not just about taking pictures, because they're separate, but you have a genuine want to understand the craft and get better and take authorship for the work that you create and produce, then how you start that journey matters. When you start off on an SLR, it forces you into a relationship with the craft of photography that's deliberate. You become more patient and grounded and understand the fundamentals a little bit more. It removes all of the shortcuts and it gives you just enough resistance to help build something real. And the foundation that you build in the early years with a camera that doesn't let you hide away from your mistakes and makes you understand those fundamentals is just the foundation that everything else gets built upon. I said this in the film photography video that I made in the past, so I want to reiterate it here. Better cameras don't make better photographers. They're made with better habits. And few things build better habits than working with a tool that make consequence unavoidable. So if you're just starting out, or maybe you find yourself at a plateau point, consider picking up an SLR. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest with you. And an SLR is always going to do that. You can check out my top film recommendations for new photographers in this article right here. Other than that, there's nothing else to really say except get out there and get shooting. You can find me and my work on Instagram, on Substack, on TikTok, and of course here on YouTube. I hope that you learned something and that you consider actually going out and purchasing your first SLR. If you have any questions, you can DM me on Instagram. This is going to be it, so get out there, get shooting, and keep moving forward. I'll catch you on the next one.